In this video, I'm going to take a look back at the first section of the video that Cheshire Police made on Operation Hummingbird. To give some context, this was released in the immediate aftermath of Lucy Letby's conviction, which is interesting in itself because it means that it must have been recorded before her conviction was made public. I will leave others to assess whether or not this was appropriate or tasteful. The first question that one might ask about this video is, why did they do it? So we've seen the efforts that the police have made to PR massage the way that this has been reported in the media before the trial, during the trial, and after the trial. We've seen these slightly, shall we say, worrying payments that are being made to this company that's owned by Caroline Cheetham, the Daily Mail journalist, that has been criticised in the Daily Telegraph, and I think not without good reason, even though it's hard to say precisely what occurred and why that it occurred. And then also, of course, we do know very well that they had certain favourable journalists that they invite to their early press conferences and so on. The second question that one might like to ask is, why have Cheshire Police gone so quiet recently? So I have the Twitter feed on the screen now, and you can see that they still haven't tweeted a single thing since the 8th of December 2024, and they had made something like 45,000 tweets previously. So it seems to me completely unacceptable to just stop doing something that is supposed to be part of their community service. It's supposed to be part of what they deliver to Cheshire as a county, that they tweet regularly. As you can see, they're just talking here in their last tweet about Storm Darragh, and then it's just usual everyday police business. And then they just stop doing it. I assume the reason they've stopped doing it is because they know they'll be inundated with criticism. So it seems rather unacceptable to me that they just stop doing things because they know they're going to be criticised. So they've gone rather quiet in recent months and recent years. I think we can probably imagine why. So the first thing that's said in the Operation Hummingbird video is the following. Now, I should emphasise that this is a voiceover from the press conference that they conducted immediately after the trial. And I believe it's Nicola Evans that is speaking, but it doesn't particularly matter who was speaking. The following is said. I cannot begin to imagine how the families in this case feel today. I just hope that today's verdicts bring all of them some peace of mind for the future, and that we have answered some of the questions that they were looking for. Cheshire Constabulary will continue to support all of the families in this case in the coming days and weeks ahead. There will be a period of reflection as everybody comes to terms with what they've experienced here today. So they could have opened this video with absolutely anything rather. So it's significant to me that they placed this immediate focus on the families and on what they believe to be their duty of care to the families. Now, of course, they do have a duty of care to the families, but as we'll see in latter parts of this video, in my view, they became far too fixated on getting a result for the families. And that is reflected in by their choice of this as the initial section for this promotional film. Let's be clear again as well, this is not a documentary. It has none of the qualities of a documentary. It's just something that the Cheshire Constabulary have put out as a form of PR, as a form of self-promotion, essentially. Then we get Paul Hughes. So Paul Hughes will be familiar to people that have watched this channel previously and other Lucy Letby channels who headed up this investigation. And he said the following here. When we got this, it's not a secret because it's been in the media and everything that Lucy Letby had been moved off the ward and the deaths and collapses had stopped. The immediate question for me once I'd said, yeah, we'll investigate that, was, why don't you go and arrest her right now? Which was a good question, quite difficult not to answer. So I think you mean it was quite difficult to answer, but let's not dwell on that too much. So the first thing to say about this is, he says, it's not a secret. So we immediately see, when he's talking about Lucy Letby being moved off the unit, the sort of confirmation bias that was all too evident in this case and that we'll see throughout the remainder of this video. We also know how quickly things turned around at Cheshire Police. So the timeline is on the screen now. This only lasts for a couple of weeks, but the decision to go from there being no evidence of malfeasance to announcing it to the Guardian newspaper that we're going to investigate was an extraordinarily short period of time. It was done very decisively, given that they could have decided, right, we'll do a quiet little investigation in the background. We won't release this to the media yet. But in fact, in just a matter of days, they go from, there's no evidence of malfeasance. As you can see on the 12th of May, at present, there does not appear to be any evidence of a criminal wrongdoing which would warrant a police-led criminal investigation. So on the 15th of May, when they walk into the meeting with J-Ram and Stephen Breary, they have no basis to investigate this whatsoever, and they're very strongly tending towards not investigating. So in a matter of 3 days, they completely changed their mind, as far as I can see, entirely on the basis of what Breary and J-Ram tell them. So that's a pretty extraordinary thing, and I really can't see any justifiable reason why they allowed this to happen so quickly, but we're going to go into that in more detail. I've discussed this in previous videos. It will certainly be part of this video as well, so I won't discuss this any further at this point in time, but just bear in mind that it went so quickly. From 2nd of May, the Council of Chester wrote to the police. 5th of May, there's no evidence. Already J-Ram's decided that they need to have their interest piqued. Stephanie does her review on the 8th of May. The 10th of May, they're contacted to arrange a meeting. The 12th of May, there's no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. 15th of May, they have this meeting with Breary and J-Ram, and the 18th of May, it's in the newspaper. And this is when Dr. Dewi Evans supposedly sees it for the first time. Although, as he's given more than one account of that, we can't really say confidently that this is correct. The second thing I'd like to point out is we see this statement from Paul Hughes that it's not a secret because it's been in the media and everything that Lucy Letby has been moved off the ward. Now, when I first saw that, this would have been days after Lucy Letby was convicted, when I knew a lot less about the case than I do now. I did some analysis on Reddit, and I'm going to discuss some of that during this video. But when I first encountered this, I assumed that it was true. Of course, it's not true at all. Why would it? Why would it be true? There was no newspaper articles from 2016 to say Lucy Letby had been moved off the ward, and there's nothing from 2017 either. You can see the two articles together here. I did a couple of searches here with ChatGPT to see if they could find any newspaper articles or any references to Lucy Letby. I knew that it wouldn't, because logically, can you imagine there being a media article like, a relatively junior nurse has been moved from one department to another at a relatively obscure hospital in Cheshire? Why on earth would there be a newspaper article about it? So when Paul Hughes says, of course it wasn't a secret because it'd been in the media, completely untrue. Not true at all. Now, even then, even if it was true, at the time when I first encountered this and I wrote about it on Reddit, I thought, well, that's a very clear sign of confirmation bias. But not only is it a clear sign of confirmation bias, Paul Hughes can't even get an account of events accurate in his own mind. Such was the confirmation bias. Because, of course, Lucy wasn't named until the police dug up her garden. It was leaked to the press, and the press reported on it, and then Lucy Letby was named. Really, she shouldn't have been named at that time, but that wasn't until 2018. She definitely wasn't named in 2016. So even that statement is untrue. So then Paul Hughes says the following. The immediate question for me once I said, yeah, we'll investigate, that was, why don't you go and arrest her right now? Which was a good question, quite difficult not to answer. As I mentioned, he meant quite difficult to answer. So he's already floating here the idea that they should have investigated Lucy Letby. So it's obvious that Lucy Letby was involved because it had been in the press, except that it hadn't been in the press. So people would say to him, why didn't you just arrest her immediately? So he's now floating the idea that he should investigate Lucy Letby and even arrest her, despite the fact that there was no evidence. We know there's no evidence. I've been over this multiple times. This case arrived with Cheshire Police and they made the statement, there is no evidence other than coincidence. I've been over that in the video that's on the screen now, but I've also been over that in multiple videos. Until the 15th of May, that I've just discussed in the timeline, when Breary and Jayram walked into the police station, Cheshire Police had no evidence of malfeasance, by their own concession. So it would have been pretty hard to arrest Lucy Letby, although it seems that they'd already made up their mind that she was the only suspect and the only possible explanation was malfeasance. So Breary and Jayram did a pretty good job. I mean, I've been over the content of that meeting and they made it absolutely crystal clear that they suspected Lucy. They practically identified, they might as well have just said, we think it's Lucy Letby. They identified her. There would have been no doubt in the police's mind who the suspected nurse was. There could be no doubt. And this is perhaps why Hughes got mixed up and thought that the media had named her. Or maybe it's a deliberate lie that he said there. I don't think it is. I think he's so confused about this crappy investigation that he probably genuinely believes the media named her in 2016 or 2017. He's forgotten how much confirmation bias there was. He's forgotten how easily he was convinced by having these two consultants walk into the police station and feed him some information. As I've said numerous times, much of it is inaccurate. So he probably actually has started to create this false narrative in his head where, we already suspected Lucy even before the consultants turned up. Wrong, because it was never in the press. Why would it be in the press? So then Paul Brains Hughes says the following. But ultimately we've seen many times in investigations like this where we've gone the wrong way. Police nationally have gone the wrong way, jumped into a suspect. Now, my view of that was by investigating that it could be anyone. It means we're not focused on one person. So investigating that it could be anything, it means you're not focused on any one event. So we basically know now. At the time, this was the Reddit thread that I created myself on the 25th of August 2023. So you can see below, there's the Guardian article from the 18th of August 2023. So I wrote this Reddit thread on Operation Hummingbird, given my responses just a week after they released this video. It's less than a week because I don't think it came out on the day of the conviction. It may have been a couple of days later. It's difficult to find the precise date because Cheshire Police took it down. But it's less than a week after the conviction. And so my immediate comment regarding this remark of Hughes that I'll just put on the screen again about not going down the wrong route. So I said, or wrote, did you investigate other people? Did you investigate doctors? Did you make a presumption of innocence for those that initially contacted you? So you can see me writing this down here. Did you investigate other people? Did you investigate doctors? Did you make a presumption of innocence for those that initially contacted you? So we now know the answer to those questions definitively. Did they investigate other people? No. Did they investigate doctors? No. Did they make a presumption of innocence for those that initially contacted you, i.e. Breary and Jayram? Yes, definitely. So, again, if you look at the timeline for this, it changed so quickly. It changed on a dime, as Americans say. Turned on a dime is the expression, I believe, because of the meeting of Breary and Jayram. So clearly they never held them responsible in any way. And then the next thing as well is we now know for definite that the consultants picked the cases. We knew this anyway, but it's been confirmed yet again in this email thread that Peter Elston has released where he had a conversation with Dowie Evans. So we know that the consultants picked the cases. Then the consultants were described by Hughes himself as the golden thread for the police investigation. So this is just so deeply inappropriate. And then if we go back to the Reddit of the time, there are some, if you actually read the comments, we pretty much nailed this already within a few days. Not just myself, but other posters as well. We pretty much already knew what the police had done wrong. We could already see the confirmation bias. We could already see the problems. We could almost see everything that they'd done already. All that we've had since then really is more information and confirmation of that. So we have a lot more information than we had. But if they just had a few critical things in there, then this could have been prevented. So this poster here writes, "It sounds like they were given a pre-selected bundle of suspicious notes from the hospital." Correct. Rather than going in themselves and deciding which events were suspicious or not, they relied on the hospital to make that initial judgment call over which events required scrutiny. Correct. I mean, that's what it sounds like. Well, you're correct. So who at the hospital chose which notes would be passed on to the police, and what was the process for deciding this? So even now, we don't know what the process was for deciding this, because there's a veil been drawn around the hospital. But the people at the hospital who chose the notes, we know, were Brewery and Jayram. And we also know that Brewery and Jayram instigated the investigation. So this poster goes on to say, if this is how it happened, then there is potential to discard all events that did not relate to Letby and include only events that did right here before it even got to the police. Correct. And then, someone answers that even at this time, this is days after the conviction, already this poster saying, the case has come from Brewery and other doctors, not from the hospital itself. It was from potential suspects. Correct, again. It sounds like medical records were done in a more official capacity once the official investigation kicked off. You'd hope so, but now we know how bad that process was. However, their investigation had already been directed by the original bundle towards what records they wanted. Correct. As they said when it was announced, the focus would be on 8 deaths and 6 collapses before moving on to review other less important ones, which is again correct. And then there's some comments here as well. Not only potential suspects, but people who it was believed at the time by people close to the situation had been harassing and victimising Lucy Letby. Now we know all the full details of that. So that is absolutely correct, of course, but we now know all the details. We know it in painstaking detail. Please note, I am not saying they were harassing and victimising her. Unfortunately, we now know that they were. And I'm not saying their claims were unfounded. So They may have genuinely believed in what they're saying at the time, Brewery and Jayram, but we now know that their claims were unfounded. I'm just looking at the investigation in the context of the moment in which it happened, and you're doing that very astutely. So at that point, doctors who were accused of harassing and victimising Lucy Letby were trusted by the police to supply non-prejudicial initial evidence for the case, and in at least one case to act for the police in reviewing notes for signs of wrongdoing several months into the investigation. Again, let me be clear, I am not saying the consultants were wrong to accuse Lucy Letby. I'm not saying they were harassing her. I'm just saying that at this point, there was an understanding among some hospital staff that the consultants had been harassing and victimising Lucy Letby, and the police had no way of knowing whether this was the case or not. Indeed, not only did they have no way of knowing, they never bothered to investigate it at any stage. So how on earth was it appropriate to entrust this person and or group of people with evidence gathering? Even if none of the above was in play, it would surely be inappropriate to ask a key witness to review and gather evidence in the case. However, with the fact that these people have recently been accused of harassing and victimising the main suspect, surely this is an inappropriate way to approach the investigation and opens them up to claims of prejudice. So, I mean, another very astute comment here, and as I've shown in my videos, and as we know from documents from the Thirlwell inquiry, we know that this is all entirely legitimate, and this person is being very fair-handed, very even-handed in what they're saying we don't know they were victimised, we don't know about this, but on the face of it, it looks pretty bad. Not only did it look on the face of it pretty bad at that time, but we now know all of our worst suspicions are all true. So then Paul Hughes continues, which means that when you come later on and the defence wants to attack your investigation for being, you chose it was Lucy Letby, you chose it was this event. No, we didn't choose that, and we didn't choose that. Actually, out of choice, I wanted the experts to come back and say, we found it was a bad bug in the water, and that happened. I can then tell parents, this is tragic, but this is not murder. Again, just to immediately respond to what he's saying here, let's not forget that Brewery and Jayram were not only intimately involved in the investigation and praised by the police for being the golden thread in the investigation because they found the critical cases, but they also selected all the cases in the investigation. but yet Cheshire Police still genuinely believe this was a competent investigation. And then there's enormous confirmation bias, as we've established already, because you already said, Paul Hughes, I think that it's not a secret about Lucy. So you'd already kind of decided that Lucy was a suspect, and now you're trying to say, oh, but we selected the cases really fairly. We didn't allow confirmation bias to slip into the investigation, of course. But, we already decided that Lucy was suspicious. It's not a secret. I mean, everyone knows about it. It was in the press. I said it wasn't in the press because my mind is playing tricks on me, because I decided very, very quickly to run this investigation based on the comments of Brewery and J-Ram, who walked in on the 15th of May. And then there is a video I've made where I go through everything that was said. They, as I must emphasise once again, they immediately, you can see here, this is the very beginning. There's a little bit of talk about general stuff, and they immediately concerns about a nurse. That's literally the very first thing that they say, and then they blatantly identify Lucy. So in this section, it's 100% clear to the police that they suspect Lucy Letby has been engaging in malfeasance, as it's described. They make this absolutely clear, and they emphasise this numerous times, and they never give any other possible explanation. They certainly don't put themselves in the firing line. And conveniently for them, the police never investigate them. They don't, not only do they not consider them to be suspects, they never investigate the grievance procedure. They never really investigate anything other than Lucy Letby. Then, as to emphasise once again, they then involve, after Brewer and J-Ram walk in and single-handedly convince them to investigate this case when they had no intention of doing so, they then involve Brewer and J-Ram in the investigation, then praise them for being central to the investigation. Let's be clear, this was never an open-minded inquiry. So this is what a poster of the time said on Reddit. So they weren't just asked to investigate, they were handed a bundle compiled specifically with Letby in mind. This explains more clearly why their investigation didn't broadly analyse the entire unit, but only a specific group of deaths. So obviously, since this has been written 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now, 2 years and 3 months ago, statisticians have absolutely hammered this aspect of the investigation. So, I mean, it's generous. Let's be fair. Every time I'm describing this investigation, it's generous. You've heard Professor Jane Hutton on this channel. You've heard Professor Richard Gill on this channel. There are others such as Professor John O'Quigley who've spoken out about it, and there are many others as well. This was an inquiry that tried to prove the only hypothesis that was ever considered by Cheshire Police. That is crystal clear. The next thing I want to talk about is this comment about there being a bad bug in the water. Now, this is something I've mentioned numerous times because it immediately struck me as such a stupid remark when I first heard this film. So, this is not something that is mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to just be a bad bug in the water or just be a killer nurse. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. There could be a serial killer and there could be a bad bug in the water. Or there could be neither. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. Obviously, we now know, and it was pretty obvious from day one for me, but we now know beyond all doubt that this was a nuanced clinical picture with several factors that led to the collapse and sad demise of some of these infants, which is exactly what you would expect. But and also, let me just mention this as well. There was a bad bug in the water. There was a bad bug in the water. Cheshire Police just never uncovered it. So then Paul Hughes goes on to say the following. I'm Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes. Thanks for letting us know. Senior Investigating Officer with Operation Hummingbird. What I was presented with was effectively a number of reports written in medical jargon that tried to explain why babies had collapsed and why there was effectively a spike in numbers at the Council Chester Hospital. For me, there were more questions than answers. Why doesn't that surprise me? So I determined that we should investigate. So, again, this was another part that I can remember so clearly, crystal clearly, even though it's nearly 2.5 years since I watched this video. There was a load of reports in medical jargon. I think you'll find most medical reports have that characteristic. What he's really saying here is there were a number of reports written in medical jargon. What he's trying to say is I couldn't understand them, which is not enormously surprising given what we've observed of Professor Hughes since then. And then obviously he uses this phrase that tried to explain why babies collapsed. So let's just emphasise these are pathology and coroner reports from highly regarded experts who had examined the actual infants. So you can't play these down and say, oh, they were just trying to say what happened. Obviously, there are going to be more questions than answers for you, Paul, because you don't understand a single word that you've read. So the fact that you had more questions than answers is meaningless. And that was not the reason you started to investigate. The reason you started to investigate is because you let the consultants walk in there, you let them feed you a cock and bull story, and then you investigate that cock and bull story, and you never considered anything else. We know that now. We know that for a fact. So anything about these medical reports, that's nothing to do with why the investigation took place. Even though what you've said here is absurd, palpably absurd, and I recognise it's being absurd at the time, it's not even accurate. So all we can really do is move on to the next statement. So let's just dwell on this. I determined that we should investigate. So not only was this done entirely based on the meeting with Breary and Jairam, not only did they involve the same two consultants in the investigation, not only did they describe them as the golden thread of the investigation, but Breary identifies the insulin cases. We're going to move on to discussing that later in the video. So even then, even without the insulin cases, they were struggling to build a case. So they did everything. They were the accusers. They were the people who went into the police station and convinced them to investigate. They were the people that selected the cases. They were the people that were the golden thread of the investigation. They were the people that gave evidence against Lucy Letby in court. And they were the people that identified the key insulin cases in the court case. I would also suggest they were really the people who came up with their embolism, and that this has just been fed to Dowie Evans somehow. We don't know how. He always says, of course, I was the first person who ever said air embolism, as far as I'm aware. I'm sure he knows damn well that he wasn't the first person to say air embolism. So it's an extraordinary situation. Extraordinary. Considering that on the 12th of May, as you can see on the screen now, Darren Martland stated, at present there does not appear to be any evidence for criminal wrongdoing from the reports and reviews which would warrant a police-led criminal investigation. However, Dr. Jairam has raised some concerns, blah, blah, blah. Then we know what happened. So this idea, we looked through some reports and they were unclear, wrong. Because your colleague, Mr. Hughes, Mr. Martland, is saying there's no evidence of wrongdoing from the reports and reviews. So the reports and reviews played no part in your decision to investigate Lucy Letby. I mean, investigate this Council Chester Hospital dispassionately. So then we have Simon Blackwell, who later describes his rank and so forth. It's not particularly important to me. It may be very important to him, but it doesn't matter to me at all. You don't often hear of multiple child, baby, infant deaths. They are extremely rare. One is rare enough, as it is, and tragic enough. But if you have a number of potential babies who have died or have been harmed, it is absolutely hugely important. So there are numerous comments to make about this passage. The first thing is the obvious question when he makes the statement, you don't often hear of multiple child, baby, infant deaths. Why? Why don't you hear about them? It's because the police aren't usually called in. They usually happen within a hospital. It's either dealt with internally or there's a medical investigation. It's not a news story and then there's a police investigation, etc., etc. And then usually the police don't tell the Guardian immediately. Also, usually hospitals listen to the pathologists and coroners. Usually they don't have sewage running around their neonatal unit. There's lots of things that usually happen. So to say that you don't often hear these things, there's a reason that you don't often hear these things. Secondly, as with so much in this video that I'm going to go over, it's not even true. There are often multiple child deaths, particularly among preterm, low birth weight neonates. So he's actually making the extraordinary statement here from absolutely no medical knowledge whatsoever that one baby infant death is rare. It's not rare. They're happening every day. And I've said numerous times previously, and I'll say again, what the NHS and what medical science has done in terms of infant mortality rates, even though there's been big problems in maternity units that we've discussed in previous videos, nevertheless, the reduction of infant mortality is an amazing achievement for the human race. But to say that one death of an infant is rare is just not true. It's categorically untrue. As I will say so often about things that the police say, it's just completely incorrect. And indeed, there was a Reddit poster at the time who said, I can immediately think of 4 neonatal units that have seen a significant rise in deaths in recent years: Morecambe, Shrewsbury and Telford, Nottingham and East Kent. As I've just mentioned, there is currently a maternity scandal going on in which 14 NHS trusts are the focus of a national maternity investigation. And then, considering that there were twins and triplets on this unit, it's even less surprising among this cohort of infants. I'm just citing one article or one piece of information here. This is from an organisation that studies twins. And the headline here is, new statistics show neonatal death risk 5 times greater for twin or triplet pregnancies compared to carrying one baby. That's part of the Embrace UK Perinatal Mortality Surveillance Report. So ultimately, there are numerous things that the police could have done. Apologies that the drawing of this isn't better, but ChatGPT didn't quite do what I asked the technology to do. I must concede it's still better than I could have done, so I'm not going to quibble too much. But this is a kind of representation of the numerous things the police could have done. They could have thoroughly investigated the hospital. They could have investigated the background to the grievance procedure raised by Lucy Letby that was upheld against the consultants. They could have considered the consultants to be suspects. They could have investigated past reports by the Royal College and others. They could have examined the coroner and pathology reports and requested serious medical assistance with this. Of course, they didn't do any of that. But they did manage to turn up and accept their awards. I must say they're completely undeserved awards. So then the video continues. I'm Detective Superintendent Simon Blackwell. I'm the strategic lead, or PIP, for the investigation. These things are far from routine. They're extreme, even nationally, internationally very rare. So to hear that there may be allegations of assault or concern at a hospital in our area was a huge thing. So again, he's emphasising the rarity, but I would immediately ask him, how rare? Did you do any investigation into how rare these things were, and did you do any investigation into whether or not they were rarer than a serial killer nurse? Did you question the possible vested motivations for these allegations, or did you assume that they were entirely virtuous? We of course now know the answer to that question. They never questioned the motivations for 1 second. They never asked any question of the consultants, or indeed anyone other than Lucy Letby. So Paul Hughes now speaks. The way we work on MIT, which stands for Major Investigation Team, is as a team, we go and take actions and come back and deliver them actions. But this was different. It was a different investigation, so we had to go back and scrap that, so we made the decision to give each detective their own investigation. Now, I'm not going to go into this all over again because I critiqued this in the previous video, Lucy Letby Analysis, Liz Hull interviews Paul Hughes. The very obvious problems with the selection of cases, confirmation bias is running right through the whole so-called investigation. So I won't dwell on this any further, but this idea that we gave people separate cases is bad enough in itself. But the police themselves are going to shoot holes in this theory in a very short order. So now we have Darren Riley saying the following. I remember going into the office, and when I first joined and speaking to Paul at length, I knew that there was going to be a case to answer, because otherwise you wouldn't be gathering people. Then I was given a couple of babies to investigate. I mean, you actually could, it beggars belief, you actually could not make this up. I mean, this is a classic example of why it's so immensely painful to go through this again. It was bad enough just a few days after the conviction, when I knew nothing, basically, and all I had was my intuition and common sense. But now it's truly torturous to go through this. But Hughes just said, we made the decision to give each detective their own investigation to supposedly avoid bias. But apparently he's been chatting to this guy, Riley, and he's already made his mind up before he even started to look at the cases that basically there's going to be a case to answer and that there's definitely been a crime. So then Darren Riley continues, and one of them, they were the twins, one of which is an insulin case, and it was very quickly obvious that someone, whether it be Letby or not, someone did administer insulin to this particular baby. So this is another example of someone on this unit who's suffering with amnesia, because the insulin cases were found by Dr. Stephen Breary. This is an account from the Observer. There's also an account in Vanity Fair in an article called The Hand That Rocked the Cradle that I've shown previously. But I won't show the Vanity Fair on this occasion, I'll just show the Observer. If there was a smoking gun in this medically complex case, it was uncovered by one of Letby's colleagues. On the night before Valentine's Day in February 2018, nearly a year after police launched their investigation. Did you hear that, Darren? It's not quite a year, it's actually 9 months. So perhaps, I think you could say 9 months is nearly a year, but it's certainly not very quickly obvious, is it, Darren? Although you decided immediately, you decided just from talking to Paul before you even looked at the cases that you've been given. So this is 9 months, of course, into the investigation, the so-called investigation, I think we should describe it as, the investigation that has been entirely focused on Lucy Letby since day one. And then he's saying, we basically knew because of the insulin, although actually looking back at it now, we didn't get the insulin for 10 months. Remember that this video is supposed to be propaganda for the police. It's supposed to be a puff piece, as they describe it in the media sometimes and in journalism. And they can't even get the basic details straight. This is the best material they had as well. This isn't the stuff they edited out of the video. We can only guess what that was like. So then we move on to Lucy Kennedy, who says the following. The investigation team realised that they needed expert witnesses to help them with the investigation. They got in touch with the National Crime Agency. So they have a list of database of expert witnesses. They provide the vital key evidence for the investigation. They also advise us as police officers on medical terminology or medical practices, because we, our police officers, we didn't have any idea. I certainly didn't have any idea about any kind of medical terms or even what to look for within these medical records. Not many investigations have so many expert witnesses, and not many investigations rely on so many opinions of these expert witnesses. So it's a total unique role to policing. So one point that's just occurred to me as I'm reading this out is, you did have Stephanie Davies in your organisation, who is very well trained and, as we've seen, a highly intelligent person, and she actually gave you a steer on these cases. So that's something that I will briefly mention before I go into the main points. It is reasonable for them to state that they don't have any medical knowledge, but the interesting statement here, from our perspective, is the NCA stuff. So we see them state that they got in touch with the National Crime Agency. So we all know what went down at the National Crime Agency. Dr. Evans has already seen in The Guardian, according to his latest account, although he'll probably change it again in the future, that he'd seen that there was a case and he'd written to the National Crime Agency touting himself for business, although he claims that he wasn't touting himself for business. Who knows what he was actually doing? It seems to me not unreasonable to say that he was touting himself for business. So, as we established in this video, we see this statement here about there being so many expert witnesses that Lucy Kennedy makes. But as we established in the interview of Paul used by Liz Hull, they began this investigation with just Dr. Evans, and Lucy was arrested before they had any evidence from anyone else. So they're trying here to emphasise the fact there were loads of expert witnesses as if they've done something really thorough. But as you'll see in the remainder of this video, we already know that Lucy was arrested when they'd only heard from Dr. Evans, but you'll see how little any other witnesses are mentioned in the rest of this video, i.e. they're not mentioned at all. Only Dr. Evans is mentioned. It becomes crystal clear, as we know by now anyway, as has been obvious for a long time, but we now know this beyond any doubt, that Dr. Evans has been beyond central to this investigation. Dr. Evans is the investigation, and they make that very clear in this video. So then Lucy Kennedy continues. I'm Detective Sergeant Lucy Kennedy. I'm part of Operation Hummingbird. When I joined the investigation, started looking through every bit of evidence that we've got, I think it became apparent of just the severity of the investigation. In total, there are 8 main expert witnesses, and we also have an independent nurse advisor. So let me just mention about the independent nurse advisor that, as Michelle Warden told us when I interviewed her, this lady, I believe her name was Elizabeth Morgan, knows nothing about neonatal nursing. So again, we see Lucy Kennedy here building up all of the expert witnesses. Then she says this. In July 2017, there was a meeting held with the expert witness. So now she describes him as the expert witness, as if there are no others. We had then the massive task of putting together the medical bundles for him to look through for all the different cases that we wanted him to review. What happened to all the other expert witnesses, Lucy? It is Lucy Kennedy. And then the other thing I'll mention here is that Evans himself stated that he asked for a specific period. So he has said, and gone on record as saying, I said, give me all of the cases from this period. Whereas here, Lucy Kennedy is suggesting that that the police, and she was involved in this process, somehow had to bundle the cases together. And they somehow had to work out what to give him. Whereas, according to Dr. Evans, he just said, right, I want this date to this date, I'll go away and work it all out, and then I'll decide there's inflicted harm. And I'll also just mention, this is the infamous 10-minute meeting that Lucy Kennedy is referencing here. And of course, Dr. Evans' recent statements in Panorama suggest that he decided there was inflicted harm in less than 10 minutes, possibly 4 or 5 minutes, or possibly when he was in the car park, or maybe even before that. It was quite a challenging task, that, because it's been described as the medical files have just been thrown up in the air together. It is just the way they were brought to us, and we are not medical experts, we're not even medically minded. So it was hard for us to fathom how to support this medical bundle together, which also was a challenge for the expert, not the experts, please note, who then received it to go through some of these medical records, 1,000 pages long, because some of the babies had been in the unit for weeks or months. We then took it to him for him to review, and he would decide whether there was a suspicious case or a non-suspicious case. So let's reflect on this for a while. Firstly, the police, by their own admission, have no idea. We're still seeing again this suggestion that the police selected the medical bundle, whereas Dewi Evans has said differently. He said that he gave him the dates and he said, just give me everything. So I'm not sure why there is these differing accounts. But as the police themselves, we've seen that their memories and their account of events are not reliable. And as we've also seen the accounts of Dr. Evans are far from reliable, it's very difficult to say whether the police are correct, whether Dr. Evans is correct, or whether neither of them are correct. It's impossible to say. The second thing I should emphasise, obviously I've made this point several times in the video previously, is that the consultants were the sole reason they started the investigation, and they selected the cases because the police don't have a clue what to do. They then let Dr. Evans run the whole investigation. They then arrested Lucy Letby entirely based on Dr. Evans' work after the executives had clearly identified, the consultants had clearly identified her in the meeting, which was the sole reason they even began this investigation. Then John Sweeney found out that Lucy Letby's name is all over the case notes, but it's clear that the police only investigated one possibility anyway. Some of them made their mind up immediately that there'd been a crime. And then we should also mention this point that they allowed Dr. Evans to submit 25 further reports after he definitely did know the name of Lucy Letby. So overall, pretty abysmal investigation. But let's move on to the next comment in this so-called documentary, which is from Paul Hughes. What we found out was in neonatal infants, it's very clear that they know when a baby is going to collapse and die, and parents are already prepared for that. And that neonatal units, which my expectation was that it's full of sick babies that could die at any moment, is actually not. So they explain that these babies do not die. So if a baby collapses, it's usually expected, and even on the outside chance of it being unexpected, it's always explainable. What separated this collection of events away from everything else was that they were only unexpected and unexplained, and that was then serving as the key significant factor of me deciding this. Now, I'm sure this is very frustrating for people that know the case who are observing this. I mean, this is total rubbish for so many reasons. Obviously, the assertion that it's always predictable is total nonsense. This sudden infant death syndrome that leads to quite a high percentage of unexplained deaths, never mind collapses. We know that the hospital missed all kinds of symptoms. Collapses were not necessarily sudden. It could have been that they appeared sudden, but they'd missed the signs and symptoms that were pointing to collapse. It therefore doesn't follow that these collapses were unpredictable. Perhaps they could have been predicted, but this whole notion that they're always predictable is just total rubbish. Essentially, this statement that Paul Hughes is making here is just some absolute nonsense that Dr. Evans has fed to him, and which has been repeated witlessly by the police ever since. Did they seek a second opinion? Did they ask anyone else? Did they do any research? Did they even Google this? No. They just accepted it and then repeated it. And literally anyone will tell you, anyone with any medical qualifications, let alone neonatal experience, that it's total crap. Not only have they repeated this crap, but according to Hughes, it is, quote, the key significant factor of him deciding to investigate. Although we know that's not true. We know that's not true because essentially this was decided for him on the 15th of May. Now, Brewery and J-Ram may have conveyed this idea that the collapses were unexplained, but really it was just the consultants that convinced him. The key significant factor, though, according to him, was something that is erroneous. And then, of course, on top of that, he'd already told The Guardian by the 18th of May that they were investigating, just 3 days after the Brewery and J-Ram meeting, and Dr. Evans now claims this is when he saw this in the newspaper, although that claim is dubious because he said different things previously and is essentially willing to say anything. So leaving aside all the medical problems with this statement, I want to convey something else to you. So it's important to understand the false reasoning that can occur with such underlying assumptions, even if they were correct. So imagine if you were to make the assertion most people do not die on planes, and then you found a commercial flight on which everyone had died. This may seem like a massive statistical anomaly, but in fact, the plane that you're examining crashed. So what seemed like a suspicious or statistically unusual circumstance had a very obvious prosaic underlying explanation. In this situation, we now know what that prosaic underlying explanation was. It was the sanitary conditions of the unit. They were understaffed, underskilled, and they made loads of mistakes. That's why you had this statistical anomaly. And then there's another tendency, which is that as human beings we want things to have neat explanations. We want to understand things, and so we seek patterns and attempt to extract explanations from these patterns. This can lead to many positive discoveries, but also to erroneous conclusions. It does not necessarily follow that just because there was a statistically unexpected number of deaths, that they are linked. In enough hospitals over enough years, given enough cases, the same thing will happen again. If you, as an example, saw in the National Lottery the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 came up, I'm sure that's never happened. The odds of it occurring are 10 billion to 1. But if you ran a computer simulation 10 billion times, it would happen at least once on average. Sometimes it would happen more than once, sometimes it wouldn't happen at all. But that wouldn't mean it was an oddity if it happened in the lottery, or that the draw had been fixed or something like that. It just looks unusual to our human eyes. But in reality, it's no more unusual for 1, 2, 3, 4 5 and 6 to be drawn than any other combination of numbers. If you're looking at the counts of Chester, it's obviously vastly more complex than a completely random draw with many, many more factors, but an unusual situation shouldn't be inherently suspicious. There can be a thoroughly benign explanation for such deaths, or even no unifying explanation at all. They should have known that at the time. But if there was 1 million hospitals with 1 million neonatal units and they operate for 1,000 years, this would definitely happen again, numerous times. This is the kind of thing that they were unable to understand. They just said, oh well, if babies die, we should automatically know why the babies have died. That's rubbish for starters. And then if there's an unusual number of deaths, there's got to be something suspicious about it. No, there doesn't. And it's obviously, with the benefit of hindsight now, so tragic to see him saying, we looked at the figures and we knew something bad had taken place. I wrote this at the time on Reddit. I mean, I'm essentially recounting what I wrote at the time here. But now we know so much more about it. It's just so tragic that their reasoning was so skewed away from where it should have been. And it indicates once again, we've discussed this in previous videos, how bad the general standard of maths and statistics is. But unfortunately, this is appalling reasoning mixed with appalling medical knowledge to draw conclusions that are, not surprisingly, errant from anything rational. And indeed, this poster said on Reddit at the time, the idea that when a baby collapses it's always explainable is so inaccurate. Anyone with a basic knowledge of paediatrics has heard of bruise and SIDS. I'm not saying that this cluster event was not suspicious, but that statement is so incorrect, and I wonder where he got it from. Of course, we know where he got it from now. He got it from Dr. Evans. The RCPCH report even mentions 2 unexplained, unexpected deaths of infants at another hospital in the region in the same period. So then this is what I wrote on Reddit at the time. Even for me, as someone with no medical background, this seems so unbelievably dubious. I found some figures on the subject. According to the Office for National Statistics, in 2021, 2,323 infant deaths and 852 child deaths occurred in England and Wales. These figures were both higher than in 2020. In 2021, the infant mortality and child mortality rates in England and Wales were 3.7 deaths per 1,000 live births and 8 deaths per 100,000 population the same age respectively. The neonatal mortality rate was 2.7 deaths per 1,000 live births in England and Wales, with the mortality rate increasing for neonates of short gestational ages. These are not huge figures, obviously, but they're not trivial either. And obviously, these are not collapses, they are deaths. The figure for collapses will clearly be much higher. I can't make any medical assertions, but I can't believe that all of this is universally expected to happen. I also saw a comment from a nurse, I believe in a YouTube video, and she stated that alarms would go off with regularity on neonatal wards, while babies often develop bleeds on the brain. I can't comment on this. Does anyone else have an opinion on it? So it's pretty clear to me at that time, pretty clear to this other poster, that the other poster had more medical knowledge than me. I know a little bit more about it now, of course. But it was very obvious at the time that these statements were rubbish, but yet the police never even questioned them for a second. They didn't question a single word the consultant said to them. They didn't question a single word that Dr. Evans said to them. They just repeated what he had to say without having done any investigation whatsoever, even the most basic research. Staggering. So then Paul Hughes says the following. This is not necessarily suspicious at that time, but the events surrounding it need to be investigated, and we eventually received signed statement from Dr. Evans, who was our primary lead witness, and Dr. Evans had defined in his statements that he thought the children had been harmed by infliction and a variety of different methods for that. But of course at this stage, Dr. Evans has said, as an example, that child C had died due to natural causes, presumably because he hadn't managed to concoct an explanation that resulted in the case going to court yet. Indeed, 25 of these explanations came after the arrest of Lucy Letby. But despite the fact that now we're seeing the truth. Now we're seeing them say, Dr. Evans, the witness. When earlier on they were trying to say, oh, there was multiple witnesses, we've never done an investigation like this. But really, we know it's all Dr. Evans. We've known that for a long time. It's now crystal clear. And even in this propaganda film, where they're trying to make themselves look good, they just basically make it clear that it is Dr. Evans all the time. Then Paul, so I want to contrast these two statements, put these two statements together so you can see how ridiculous it is. So there's Paul Hughes and Darren Riley. Paul Hughes says, and then at the same time the analytical products have been coming together and the investigative products have been coming together, so reconstructed. So at that point I knew that in most cases we've been able to prove already that Lucy Letby was present. There was more work to be done and I could prove that it was inflicted harm. And then Darren Riley says, my opinion was very quickly that yes, there was something not right. Yes, the only obvious person was Lucy Letby. So, an incredible admission here. So, the first thing I want to cite is that they're talking about most cases. So, it's not even all of the cases here. They're just like, oh, Lucy's around quite a bit, so we'll just basically investigate Lucy. Despite the fact they're trying to make it sound independent and trying to make it sound like they were objective and didn't have confirmation bias, they so obviously did have confirmation bias. It could hardly be more obvious. And then Paul Hughes is saying, I could prove that it was inflicted harm. Did you ever try to do anything else, Paul? That'd be my question to you. Because it seems to me quite clear that you focused in on Lucy Letby immediately based on what the consultants did, and then you never investigated anything else at all, including the consultants themselves. We know you never investigated them because you put them in the investigation. And then Darren Einstein Riley has decided immediately that the only obvious person was Lucy Letby. So he's immediately, with no medical knowledge, yeah, something's obviously not right. Yeah, it's obviously Lucy, isn't it? And we've been told it's Lucy anyway, so it must be Lucy. I mean, according to Paul Hughes, it's already been in the media that Lucy's been taken off the unit, except it wasn't in the media, Paul, was it? Because you made it go in the media, not anyone else. What is also notable about this is that by this time, they're already trying to prove that Lucy Letby was present for collapses because they'd already decided that she was the target of the investigation. In fact, that must have happened very early on because Darren Riley says that he was of that opinion very quickly. So they're probably already trying to put together their crappy statistics and their crappy shift chart at this point. They never looked at anyone else in the hospital. They never looked at the consultants. They never looked at the Brewery and J-Ram who worked on the investigation. They had a thesis that Lucy Letby might have been involved, which was fed to them by the consultants. The consultants, they then got to investigate their own hypothesis and select the cases for their own hypothesis. They had the correlation to work from and they just proved their own correlation. The other thing to mention as well is that they couldn't prove that it was inflicted harm. There was an expert witness who thought there may be harm but couldn't explain it for many cases, but they just decided that there was harm anyway, obviously. There was no proof of anything and there were no conclusions that could be drawn, and yet Darren Riley had already drawn them by his own admission. And this is after Brewery and J-Ram had walked in and practically named Lucy Letby and definitely identified her. And then they told The Guardian immediately that they were investigating. They never looked at any other possibility. Some of the officers decided there was a crime basically immediately. And then they utilised this nonsense coincidence theory that has since been savaged by statisticians. Then they cancelled the statistical work of Professor Jane Hutton, who has since given Cheshire Police an absolute hammering on this channel. And they can't even understand that there could be a nuanced explanation. According to their own words in this documentary, there simply had to be a singular cause for this supposed spike in deaths. And they just basically allowed this utter shyster to walk into the police station and run the entire investigation when he was a million miles out of his depth. And that's the most generous thing that I can possibly say about him. So in this first section of the Operation Hummingbird video, we see so many of our initial suspicions and concerns about the police investigation can now be confirmed beyond doubt. It is very clear that this was an investigation rife with confirmation bias, run by officers who, frankly, had absolutely no idea what they were doing. There is no doubt whatsoever that Cheshire Police only ever investigated the hypothesis that Lucy Letby had caused all the deaths on the unit. This is proven by the fact that they have no intention of investigating before Lucy Letby was practically identified by Dr. Breary and Dr. J-Ram, and then they rapidly snapped into full investigation mode. We know this from the timeline that I have put together from several documents, along with information provided by Stephanie Davies. It's also crystal clear from this promotional film that Cheshire Police relied almost entirely on Dr. Evans for medical opinion. This was again also clear from the interview that Paul Hughes gave to Liz I Was in Court Every Day Hull and Caroline Cheetham, but they don't shy away from giving this opinion in this video. There are some efforts to reference multiple expert witnesses, but even then they quickly indicate that Dr. Evans is basically doing everything which we already know from the aforementioned interview with Liz Hull. This part also made it clear the important part that the flawed statistical case played in the police inquiry. This was another factor with which we were already familiar, but this so-called documentary emphasises this once more. It's also obvious that not only had the constabulary, broadly speaking, jumped to conclusions regarding a supposed serial killer nurse, but individual officers had made their mind up almost immediately that Lucy Letby was guilty. At the very beginning of this episode, we see the emphasis placed on the families of the infants in this so-called documentary. In later episodes, we will see how emotionally involved Cheshire Police became with those families and how unbalanced and inappropriate their attitude was. Finally, it's worth mentioning that there are some typically boneheaded statements made on medical matters which naturally no one in Cheshire Police bothered to research, corroborate or seek any form of second opinion on at any stage. This was not a pleasant video to make, as witnessing stupidity is never enjoyable when the consequences are so serious. This was a monumentally lousy investigation, and yet the conclusions that Cheshire Police drew so blindly and incompetently were so avoidable. This was one of several opportunities to nip this whole catastrophe in the bud, but it was one that Cheshire Police wasted. Now, they haven't even got the guts to front up, answer questions, or even perform their basic community duties as a constabulary. I'm not sure if they think doing this makes them appear more competent than if they were as willing to speak as publicly as when they were being patted on the back uncritically, but allow me to put your minds at rest, Cheshire Police, it doesn't make you look more competent.